The Auditor-General provides assurance to Parliament on the accountability and performance of the Victorian public sector. The Auditor-General conducts financial audits and performance audits and reports on the results of these audits to Parliament. On the 28th of November 2013, the Auditor-General tabled his performance audit report on racing industry grants management. This audit looked at the management of grants to Victoria's racing industry. This was an audit on the management of grants to Victoria's racing industry. By way of background, the racing industry encompasses the three racing codes: thoroughbred racing, the largest code based on income, along with harness racing and greyhound racing. The codes are governed by controlling bodies: Harness Racing Victoria and Greyhound Racing Victoria, which are both statutory authorities, and Racing Victoria Limited for thoroughbred racing, which is a private company. Together, the racing codes run about 2,000 race meetings, with their activities estimated by the racing industry to contribute around $2.8 billion to Victoria's economy. In addition to receiving funding from its joint venture with Tabcorp, the racing industry also receives funding from the Victorian Government. Funding provided by the Government since 2001 has been in the form of direct payments, compensation payments and grants. By the end of financial year 2014-15, the total direct funding received by the racing industry will total around $168 million. The most recent sources of government funding for the racing industry has been through the Regional Racing Infrastructure Fund and the Victorian Racing Industry Fund. These account for around $125 million of government funding. The Regional Racing Infrastructure Fund, or RIF, operated between 2009 and 2012. Its purpose was to support projects at racing and training facilities outside of Melbourne, and also to stimulate industry growth and development. RIF focused on projects including drought-proofing, water savings and infrastructure development. It was a non-competitive grants program, with the grant intended to be a contribution to a project. The government committed $45 million to RIF. The Victorian Racing Industry Fund, or VRIF, started in July 2011 and is intended to operate until June 2015. Like RIF, this grants program is broadly aimed at providing financial support for improvements at racing and training venues, and also to stimulate industry growth. Its key programs are the Racing Infrastructure Program and the Race Day Attraction Program. Also like RIF, VRIF is a non-competitive grants program with priority for projects where there is matching funding. The government has allocated around $79.5 million for this program over the 4 years. The objective of the audit was to assess whether the Department of Justice and the three controlling bodies were managing racing industry grants effectively and efficiently. This included examining whether there were effective processes to guide the assessment and funding of grant applications, and whether the grant programs were achieving their intended outcomes. The audit examined the role of the department in managing the grant programs and the role of the controlling bodies in managing the grant funds and the funded projects. While Racing Victoria Limited is a private company, we were able to include it in the audit because the Audit Act enables us to follow the dollar, so to speak, where funding is through grants. As is probably already apparent, the audit focused on the two most recent grant programs, RIF and VRIF. The audit concluded that the management of racing industry grants has been administratively weak, particularly over the last 5 years. Key weaknesses included a lack of guidance to assist the department in determining whether applications had met funding criteria and inadequate recording of application assessments. While administrative improvements have been made under VRIF, there is still much to be done to improve transparency and accountability. The audit also identified weaknesses in the management of publicly funded projects, primarily by the two statutory authorities. There has also been no assessment of whether the funded projects and grants program have achieved desired outcomes. For both grants programs, the Department of Justice developed clear funding criteria and improved them for VRIF to reduce the risks it identified. However, the effort in developing the funding criteria was undermined by the lack of any guidance for the assessors to determine whether the criteria had been met or the extent to which they had been met. Our assessment of RIF grant applications shows that many applications did not address the criteria, contained limited supporting information, and many included no costings. Despite this, all 117 RIF applications were funded. Our effort to understand the assessment processes was undermined by the absence of records detailing the assessments for RIF and inadequately documented assessments for VRIF. VRIF assessments record whether an application is consistent with the criteria, but does not record the judgments that underpin the overall assessment. Apart from the lack of transparency and accountability associated with poor record-keeping practice, the Minister for Racing, responsible for approving applications, also does not receive complete and robust information on which to base decisions. Decision makers having sound advice on which to base decisions is fundamental to transparent and accountable processes. The Department established funding agreements for all grants made under RIF and VRIF. While the agreements included rights for the state that provided protections around its financial contributions, the Department did not routinely exercise these rights. As a consequence, the Department has not adequately managed the funding agreements or adequately held the controlling bodies to account for their use of grant funds. This was particularly so in relation to monitoring project progress, with 80% of RIF projects not submitting project reports as required, and 60% of VRIF projects not submitting reports. Without project reports, the Department had little oversight of the progress of projects it funded and little oversight of the expenditure of public funds. Time overruns were common for many of the projects we reviewed, reflecting the lack of oversight and also the failure to enforce milestones that formed part of the agreements. In relation to project finances, the Department did not enforce the requirement that RIF grants over $20,000 be supported by a report of audit with their final funding claim. Under VRIF, this is no longer a requirement. Similarly, requirements for statutory declarations by the grant recipients outlining the final project costs were not routinely provided or enforced. There were also weaknesses in how the controlling bodies governed the grant funding they received. This was primarily the case for Greyhound Racing Victoria and Harness Racing Victoria, with Racing Victoria Limited's governance generally sound. Weaknesses of both Greyhound Racing and Harness Racing related to their procurement and project accounting practices, and also their record management practices. Procurement weaknesses were evident for tender processes and probity, a failure to test the market by using the same consultants and contractors for extended periods, and the absence of contracts for consultants. These practices are likely to result in reduced value for money obtained from the grant funding. There were also weaknesses in the record management around the grant funding and project documentation, with Greyhound Racing's in particular not in a state that could be readily audited, and gaps in the information at Harness Racing. While Greyhound Racing has been working to address these weaknesses since June 2012, Harness Racing has more work to do to get their practices to an appropriate standard. Grants typically are used to contribute to the achievement of policy objectives. Understanding whether objectives have been achieved is fundamental to grants administration, and in determining whether the use of public funds is achieving intended benefits. Despite this, neither the Department nor the controlling bodies have assessed whether RIF and VRIF have achieved their intended outcomes, and neither has plans to do so. While VRIF requires applicants to include measures to demonstrate successful outcomes, There's also been no assessment of the extent to which the measures have been met. The failure to appropriately assess performance of projects and the grants programs is contrary to better practice in grants administration and contrary to effective governance of public funds. Fortunately, it's something that the department has committed to address. Which brings me to the recommendations. The audit made 11 recommendations, 6 of which related to the department, 1 for Greyhound Racing Victoria, and 4 for Harness Racing Victoria. There were no recommendations relating to Racing Victoria Limited, reflecting its comparatively better performance around grants management governance. All agencies have accepted all recommendations, and in the case of the Department of Justice in particular, has committed to a time frame within which it will address the recommendations. All our reports are available on our website. If you have any questions about this or other reports, or if you have anything else you would like to discuss with us, including ideas for future audit topics, please call us on 03 8601 7000 or contact us via our website.